As you may have noticed by the title of the video, this is the start of a new series. So, everyone, welcome to Fuzzy Dice Friends. This series will give us a chance to take a look at other people's cars and their stories with them. We can use these episodes to work on other people's cars, talk to them about their cars, or maybe do a bit of both. There are some project cars owned by other people that will get an entire series devoted to them. But this series will be mostly for smaller jobs, cars that don't end up being large projects that have limited video and photo documentation, and covering some of the stories that other people have with their cars. Every car and every car owner has a story. Not all of them may consider themselves car people or gearheads, but anyone who's had an experience with a car has a story to tell. And for this first episode, we're going to talk about a friend's 1987 Toyota Supra. Back in 2016, our friend Rob was looking for a project car, and Leon found this Supra on Craigslist for $1,200. The seller said it had a blown head gasket but would still run and drive. Despite liking the car, Rob declined because it wasn't exactly the kind of project he wanted at the time. But then, next thing we knew, just a few days later, Leon purchased the car and had it dropped off at his house. Leon has always had an affinity for Supras, and this is, at least, his third one. In addition to the, at the time, newly purchased 1987 Mark III Supra, he also has two Mark II cars, although they're not in driving condition. But we set out on a mission to prevent the 87 from ending up like that and get it back on the road. Just a short while after Leon bought his car, there was a particular vehicle I was interested in buying. This happened to be a particular 1988 S10 Blazer. I was going to rent a U-Haul trailer to get the S10 back to my house anyway, so that morning we used the same trailer to bring the Supra over as well. And shortly after dropping it off, we got to work replacing the cylinder head gasket. A year prior to this, in 2015, I had spent some time helping a different friend build his 7M GTE for his 1977 Celica. So initially it didn't seem like the head gasket replacement on a different 7M engine, the one in the 1987 Supra, would be a big problem. But as things often are, the project was more time-consuming and complicated than originally anticipated. The Supra's engine bay was a mess of vacuum hoses and wires, so we needed to make sure that everything got put back together the same way it came apart. Or at least, close enough. Once we finally had dug down to the cylinder head, we noticed that it had ARP head bolts already installed. Toyota's 7M engines don't exactly have a great reputation as far as head gaskets are concerned, and apparently this one had had an issue in the past. Our best guess is that whoever previously installed these bolts did not use ARP's info and used the lower Toyota factory torque spec. But just in case that wasn't the problem, and just to be safe, Leon had the head resurfaced at a machine shop. And to be extra secure, he got a set of ARP head studs instead of their bolts. We never actually took the valves out of the head, which ended up being a mistake. Another thing that 7Ms don't have a great reputation for is the longevity of their valve stem seals. But at the time, we were just focused on getting it back together and running, so we got a new head gasket on the block, installed the cylinder head, properly torqued down the ARP head studs, and put the rest all back together. There was some weird stuff that we ran into along the way, like this connector that didn't actually go to anything. I ended up asking about this on a forum, and we were told that this is the ABS connector, and since this car doesn't have ABS, I guess the factory just left it open and hanging there. Which was confusing and seems pretty bizarre. Also, the fact that the spark plug wires don't hook onto the spark plugs at all. The boots loosely hook into a valley plate, but there's not really a heck of a lot keeping them on the plugs. Then, after putting most of the car back together, it was time to change the oil. Only the oil filter was stuck on there, and stuck worse than any other I had or have since seen. In most cases, when an oil filter is hard to remove, it's because of the location. That wasn't the case here, it was quite accessible. I ended up absolutely tearing the oil filter apart completely down to its base. Then I made this simple little tool which hooked into the ports at the base and let me use a wrench to unscrew it. Even with a breaker bar, it was easily 80 foot-pounds of torque to loosen it up. I still have no idea on how anybody could have gotten that thing so tight. Can-in filters like this have a hex on the end, but it's just stamped steel and it won't stand up to a whole lot of loosening or tightening force. But no matter, at least the oil filter was off. Then, finally, we were able to actually change the oil, install a new filter, and the car was ready to start. It had to crank for quite a while before it wanted to start, but once it did, the engine was sounding strong. It was also smoking a little bit, which we were hoping was just from crap that the blown head gasket had allowed into the exhaust. Okay, well, a little bit of smoke may have been an understatement. There was a while there where the car smoked pretty hardcore until I guess it eventually burned out everything that was sitting in the exhaust. The car still does smoke a bit on cold starts, which again is probably due to bad valve seals, but at least it isn't as bad as it was in this particular clip. After running it for a little bit, just for good measure, we ended up draining and refilling the coolant once again to help clean things out and to make sure there wasn't any oil left in the system. It was obvious from the coolant reservoir that at some point this car had been repainted. When Leon purchased it, some of the clear coat was already starting to peel, and unfortunately it's only gotten worse in recent years. But at least the newly repaired engine seemed to be doing okay. One of the exhaust manifold bolts stripped its threads out when removing it. Leon got a set of exhaust studs so that this wouldn't happen again. For the one that stripped out, we simply tapped it for a 7/16 inch bolt since it fit perfectly in the manifold without drilling anything and the threads had good engagement. The interior of the car had quite a few quirky components too, and we ended up doing some work with the headlight switch, but it was a while before Leon was able to actually get the right part for it. There was a fair amount of other work the car still needed, but at this point we were able to drive it back to Leon's house, and, well, unfortunately it sat there for another year and a half. Leon did some work here and there in the spare time he could find, and eventually the car was almost ready to get back on the road. And one day he called me over to help him bleed the brakes. He had installed the new master cylinder, and before the car could be driven we needed to get all of the air out of the lines. We put the rear of the car up on jack stands, removed the wheels, and bled the rear brake calipers. We had a few issues since the jack and jack stands kept sinking into the mud, but we managed to get it done. Then we set the rear of the car back down, switched to the front, and repeated the same process. Pretty soon we had gotten all the air out of the brake lines and the car was back on the ground. Leon started the car up and everything sounded like it was running great. We let it run for a minute, then did a little bit of test driving to make sure the brakes were actually working. And with everything checking out, the Supra hit the road properly for the first time in a long time. The car was putting along happily and did not appear to be having any issues. We drove all the way to a gas station and gave it its first fill up in a long time. Not everybody was happy about this though, as this little guy was trying to build a home underneath the gas store. But other than those evictions, the car was doing really well, and for the first time in a long time, it was bringing smiles to our faces. The car finished its test drive without issues, and the next day, Leon brought it over so that we could take a look at the headlights. The high beams worked normally, but when on low beams, only one of them was coming on. Luckily, the electronic lift mechanism in both was working. The headlight and turn signal stalk we had used was from a different Toyota, so it only had 3 settings for the headlights. The original switch has 4 settings so that you can lift up the headlights without turning them on. Eventually, Leon got a proper Supra headlight switch replacement, but at this time we decided to just look at the bulbs while they were still turned on. Well, the driver's side one was on, the passenger side one wasn't, and that is the problem. To get to the electrical connector at the rear of the sealed beam bulbs, there are 2 Phillips screws on each side to remove the plastic shroud, and once the shroud has been removed, there are 2 bolts on each side that retain the steel lid. With the lid off, the connector can easily be reached from up top, and we were able to get the headlight to come on just by wiggling that connector. The problem was just some corrosion on the headlight terminals, but since Leon had already gotten new bulbs, we decided to just swap them in. The sealed beam bulbs are retained by this trim piece, which is held down with 4 Phillips screws. Unfortunately, the bottom screws are not easy to get to, so we decided to just slide the headlight out with the bottom of the trim still attached. And just like that one came out, we'll slide in the new bulb, reattach the trim, plug back in the connector, then the lid, then the shroud. And now that it has 2 new light bulbs that are both illuminated, we'll make sure everything works. There you go. With the lighting working the way that it should, the car was actually ready for the road. Leon drove the car pretty much daily for a month and was having a great time with it. For the most part, the car was doing well. The engine and the new cylinder head gasket were sounding very good. At this point, the car would give a puff of blue oil smoke on startup and be fine after that. One thing that wasn't going away was a constant whining when the car was driven at higher speeds. We weren't entirely sure what the noise would be, but it seemed likely to be the differential, so Leon bought this used one off of eBay. This replacement diff matched the one on the car and appeared to be in good shape. So we went ahead and started removing the old one from the Supra. We got the rear end of the car high up in the air on jack stands and started unbolting things. We removed the bolts holding the drive shaft to the pinion flange, the CV axles at the sides of the diff, and the ones holding the differential to the body of the car. We tried to get it out of there with the exhaust installed, but it just wasn't happening, so we ended up removing the exhaust tailpipe too. Then we were able to just lower the jack and slide the differential out from under the car. It was immediately obvious that the differential had been leaking a fair bit. We went around and unbolted the cover to see if we could notice any problems inside, and pretty soon we were able to tap the cover loose and drain the oil. But once we finally took a good look at it, everything inside appeared to be in good shape. In fact, the backlash of the one we just pulled out of the car feels better than the one bought off of eBay. While we were disassembling things to get this out of the car, we noticed that the center driveshaft support bearing was in really bad shape. We also weren't prepared at all and didn't have new inner axle shaft seals for the differential. So we decided that we could at least reseal the cover and just call this one an exploratory investigation. We ended up putting this differential back in the car with new oil to see if we could fix that support bearing and get rid of that whining noise. We reinstalled the differential, and later, once Leon was able to get the right part for that center support bearing, he replaced that too. And that fixed some of the noises, but he later ended up putting the eBay differential in after all, and he seemed pretty happy after that. Over the next year, Leon spent a lot of time driving the car and fixing things here and there. He ended up going out of state for work, so I didn't see this car again for quite a while. At some point, it developed some transmission or torque converter related issues, and he had the transmission rebuilt by a local shop. After reinstalling the rebuilt transmission, the previous issues seemed to be fixed, but it was really hesitant to downshift under load. When he was back in the state for a bit, we took a look at the car and quickly realized that the transmission kickdown cable had been broken. The outer lining seems to have become very brittle with age and heat from the exhaust, and it must have snapped when they were trying to get everything reinstalled. Leon was having a lot of trouble finding a replacement for this cable, so in the meantime, just to make it work, we just taped it back together and threw on some zip ties to keep the two halves of the outer cable from sliding apart. It's ugly, and it took a little bit of adjustment of the cable, but it does work properly now. So the cable was fixed-ish, but there were some other issues the car had been having. One of which was that the rear brakes were just acting weird. We jacked up the rear of the car and took the wheels off to have a look. First impression was that the rotors had rusted pretty bad over time since the car had been sitting on multiple occasions. But the pads still had meat on them and they had ground the rotors relatively smooth, so that shouldn't have been causing our issue, even if it's not ideal. Taking a close look, we also realized that the rust had actually been eating the lug studs coming through the rotor. That necking down kind of undercut underneath the threads is definitely not supposed to be there, and this will have to be taken care of in the future. Next, we decided to loosen up the caliper and make sure everything moved freely. These calipers are bolted at the bottom and captured inside the caliper bracket at the top. On the driver's side of the car, that top slide pin that's captured in the bracket was very loose. This sure seems to me to be an excessive amount of movement. Then we noticed that somehow the lower caliper bracket bolt was actually not all the way installed. I used the term not all the way installed instead of saying that it was loose because, well, it was not loose. The bolt was extremely rusted in place, so it's not like it could have gone anywhere, but you definitely don't want that caliper bracket moving, and that may be what wore out that top pin. We ended up removing that bolt, cleaning up the threads, and then we were able to actually get it all the way installed. So the driver's side caliper is too loose on the bracket, and we went to check the passenger side caliper and realized it had the opposite problem. On this side, it appears that the slide pin has rusted and the caliper does not want to go anywhere. We didn't anticipate it being this bad, so we didn't really have anything to fix it on that day, but Leon did eventually go back and replace both calipers and brackets. When we went to put the wheels back on, I noticed that they were actually labeled left and right, and of course, the left one was on the passenger side and the right one was on the driver's side. We decided to put them back on the way they came off since the front wheels were mixed up in the same way. I'm pretty sure the only difference is the directional design of the wheels, and it doesn't really matter. The car had also been having a different problem, and that's that the transmission kept losing oil. It didn't take a lot of investigation to realize that it was coming from the transmission cooler lines at the front of the engine bay. All we had to do was idle the car for a minute and watch the fluid drip out around the hose connection. The transmission fluid comes out of the transmission, goes through a steel hardline, then into a hose, then into another steel hardline that's attached to the radiator with these two little fittings. When removing the cooler hose to replace it, I noticed that there wasn't any kind of barb and these were just smooth lines. So we cut the ends flat and gave a nice large flare with the flaring tool. And we did the same thing for the other straight line fitting, only we had an issue when we tried to put it back on the radiator. Clearly, that line had been cross-threaded in the past, and the fitting at the bottom of the radiator was pretty damaged. And unfortunately, it didn't seem like something we would easily be able to replace. We ended up just throwing some sealer on there and getting that fitting as tight as possible. Then we installed the cooler hose, clamped it down, and started the car up to look for leaks. And yeah, it seemed like there was one.
Stop, 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 stop.
The cooler lines were pretty rusty, and right behind where we installed the hose, there was a pinhole leak. Just the agitation from removing the other hose and installing this one probably loosened that up. The fix wasn't exactly textbook, but we just slid a small piece of hose all the way back, covering that pinhole leak, and clamped down around it. Eventually, those lines will need to be replaced or at least modified because of the rust. But for now, that patch will do the trick. And the car was ready to be driven again. But unfortunately, that fitting with the sketchy threads did start to leak a little. Leon went ahead and ordered a whole new radiator because it didn't seem like there even was a way to remove that fitting. We drained the coolant out of the system, and then he removed the AC fan bracket that attaches to the radiator, and then we were able to unbolt the mounts and lift it out. And here's another look at that busted fitting that is the cause for replacement. We'll take the shiny new radiator out of the box and make sure everything matches up. And what do you know, it actually matches the old one perfectly. It even has new lines for the transmission cooler connection, and we can drop it right back into the car the same way the old one came out. Then the auxiliary fan can be reattached, and we'll create a bundle of zip ties to secure the radiator. Wait, what? Yeah, when removing it, that bolt for the top driver's side mount snapped right off. The hardware used in these cars isn't exactly, well, sturdy. We didn't really have the time to drill it out or keep messing with it that day, so a bunch of zip ties will do the trick for now. And we'll go ahead and refill the cooling system. And once we connect the shiny new radiator to those old transmission cooler lines, everything is in place and we can start the car again. Here's a good example of the smoke screen the car creates if it hasn't been started recently. It's definitely not ideal, but at least it isn't billowing smoke either. The car still has some issues and is in need of more work, but at least it does run and drive. Though at this point the clear coat was peeling off like a really bad sunburn. But after all, it is a project car. And considering his fleet, Leon is definitely no stranger to those, and he will stick with it. As his first drivable Supra, a model that he's always admired since childhood, this car means a lot to him. And this is despite its penchant for problems and parts that are expensive and hard to find. He's currently out of state again, along with the car, so I haven't seen it in almost a year. But despite it not being one of my personal project cars, it is exciting every time I see it driving. Even if Toyotas aren't really your thing, I think everyone has had a problem child car at some point or another that you still really cared for. And although we're ending here, the story of it is far from over. The fight to save this car will continue on.